The film never showed the quiet power behind the table. In Goodfellas, the world of organized crime is loud. Gunshots in nightclubs, arguments in smoky bars, men screaming in restaurants while pistols appear under tables. Violence is immediate, explosive, almost theatrical. But long before the chaos of the 1970s mob era, there were men who ruled through silence. Men who did not need to shout. Men who did not need to pull the trigger. One of those men was Joe Profaci. His name rarely appears in Hollywood scripts. When it does, it is often reduced to a background figure, a relic of an earlier Mafia generation. A businessman, a traditionalist, an aging boss who preferred olive oil imports to bloodshed. But the truth was far darker. According to multiple documented accounts, Joseph Profaci was not merely a quiet patriarch of organized crime. He was one of the earliest architects of the modern American Mafia, a man whose influence helped shape the very structure that would dominate organized crime for decades. And when his power was finally challenged, the conflict that followed would ignite one of the most violent internal wars the American Mafia had ever seen. A war that nearly tore an entire crime family apart. A war that began with a simple demand: money. But to understand how that war began, investigators would later trace the story back decades earlier, back to a young immigrant who arrived in America with little more than ambition and a talent for control. Joseph Profaci was born in 1897 in the town of Villabate, Sicily. At the time, Villabate was already steeped in the traditions of the Sicilian Mafia. Local power structures were built around landowners, protection rackets, and secret societies that governed the balance of violence and loyalty. It was a world where respect was enforced with fear, and young Joseph grew up surrounded by it. By the time he reached adulthood, Sicily was a place where opportunities were limited unless a man was willing to align himself with powerful families. So, like thousands of other Sicilians in the early 20th century, Profaci left. He arrived in New York in 1921. America was already changing. Prohibition had transformed organized crime into an industry. Bootlegging networks stretched across cities. Criminal syndicates were expanding rapidly, and Italian immigrant neighborhoods were becoming battlegrounds for emerging Mafia factions. The timing of Profaci's arrival would prove critical. Unlike many street-level gangsters of the era, Profaci did not initially build his reputation through violence. Instead, he cultivated the image of a businessman. He imported olive oil. It was a legitimate enterprise. On the surface, Profaci Olive Oil Company soon became a familiar name within Italian-American communities across Brooklyn. Shipments arrived from Sicily, warehouses expanded, and grocery stores began carrying his product. But investigators would later discover that the olive oil business served another purpose. It created connections: dock workers, truck drivers, import agents, union officials, the kind of logistical network that could quietly move far more than olive oil. By the late 1920s, Profaci had already begun forming alliances with powerful figures inside New York's growing Mafia structure. And the Mafia itself was changing. The old Sicilian-style leadership was beginning to collide with a younger generation of gangsters who believed organized crime should operate more like a corporation. Profit, structure, efficiency. This transformation reached its most violent moment in 1930 during a conflict later known as the Castellammarese War. Two powerful Mafia bosses, Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, fought for total control of the Italian underworld in New York. The streets filled with assassinations. Gunmen waited outside apartment buildings. Cars exploded in broad daylight. Bodies were found in alleyways across Brooklyn and Manhattan. Dozens of mobsters were killed as the old guard struggled to maintain power. Joseph Profaci watched the chaos carefully. He did not rush into the conflict. He waited. According to multiple historical accounts, Profaci understood something many of the others did not. Wars created opportunities. When the Castellammarese War finally ended in 1931, the entire structure of the American Mafia had changed. Salvatore Maranzano briefly declared himself boss of bosses, but his rule lasted only months before he was assassinated in an operation organized by a younger generation of gangsters led by Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano reorganized the Mafia into 5 separate families in New York. Each family had a boss. Each boss had territory, and each family operated under a new governing body known as the Commission. Joseph Profaci became the boss of one of those families. It would later become known as the Profaci crime family. the organization that would eventually evolve into the Colombo family decades later. But during Profaci's reign, it was something different. It was deeply traditional. Profaci ruled with an almost feudal authority. Loyalty to him was absolute. Tribute payments were expected from every level of the organization. Soldiers pay their captains. Captains pay the boss. And the boss kept careful records of who owed what. According to investigators who later examined the structure of the family, Profaci had an unusual obsession with financial tribute. He demanded a percentage from nearly every criminal operation under his control. Loan sharking, bookmaking, union rackets, even legitimate businesses operated by members of his own organization. Some mobsters accepted it as the cost of belonging to a powerful family. Others saw it differently. They saw greed. By the 1940s and 1950s, the Profaci family had grown into a massive criminal enterprise operating throughout Brooklyn and Long Island. And Joe Profaci himself had become one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America. But his leadership style created resentment. While other mafia bosses occasionally distributed wealth to maintain loyalty, Profaci was known for hoarding profits. Members complained privately that the boss demanded tribute, even from their personal earnings. Some captains were forced to hand over enormous sums simply to maintain their positions. And over time, that resentment began to grow. Quietly at first, whispers among soldiers, complaints shared during late-night card games, then discussions among captains who believed the family was being exploited by its own leader. According to multiple documented accounts, one of the men who began listening closely to those complaints was a young, but increasingly ambitious mobster named Joseph Colombo. But Colombo was not alone. Another figure was rising within the family, a man who would soon become the center of a rebellion. His name was Joe Gallo. Unlike the traditional Sicilian bosses, Gallo represented a new generation of gangster, brash, unpredictable, and far less interested in the old rules of mafia hierarchy. He believed power should be taken, not inherited. And by the late 1950s, Joe Gallo had reached a conclusion that would shake the entire Profaci organization. Joe Profaci was no longer a boss worthy of loyalty. He was a target. And in 1961, the first move against the aging mafia boss would begin not with a gunshot, but with a kidnapping that would send shockwaves through the American underworld. And in 1961, the first move against the aging mafia boss would begin not with a gunshot, but with a kidnapping that would send shockwaves through the American underworld. By the early 1960s, Joe Profaci's empire was already showing cracks beneath its polished surface. For nearly 3 decades, he had ruled through discipline, financial tribute, and rigid loyalty. But the mafia itself had evolved. A younger generation of mobsters had grown impatient with the traditions of the old Sicilian bosses. They wanted profit, they wanted influence, and they wanted freedom from what they believed was an outdated system of tribute payments that flowed upward to men who rarely risked anything themselves. According to multiple documented accounts, the most vocal critics of Profaci's rule came from a small but volatile faction inside the family led by Joe Gallo and his brothers, Larry and Albert. The Gallos were unlike most mafia soldiers. They were flamboyant, they were reckless, and they were dangerous. Operating primarily out of Brooklyn, the Gallo crew had built a reputation for intimidation and violence that made even hardened mobsters uneasy. Their methods were loud, chaotic, and often unpredictable, traits that stood in sharp contrast to Profaci's quiet, calculated style of leadership. For years, the tension simmered beneath the surface. But by 1961, the resentment had reached a breaking point. Joe Gallo believed that the old boss had grown weak. He believed the family's money was disappearing into Profaci's personal fortune, while soldiers risked prison sentences and violent retaliation to maintain the rackets that funded the entire organization. Most of all, he believed the system could be changed. And change, in the mafia, almost always began with violence. But Gallo understood something important. Directly assassinating a mafia boss was not only dangerous, it was politically catastrophic. Killing a sitting boss could trigger retaliation from the commission and potentially ignite conflicts with other crime families who depended on stability within the New York underworld. So instead, Gallo chose a different strategy: pressure. On February 27, 1961, several members of the Profaci family disappeared. Among them were Joseph Magliocco, Profaci's trusted underboss, along with several other high-ranking capos loyal to the boss. They had been lured to a meeting in Brooklyn. Instead, they were kidnapped. The operation was swift and carefully coordinated. Gunmen surrounded the meeting location. The captives were taken at gunpoint and held in secret locations controlled by the Gallo faction. The message was unmistakable. Joe Profaci's authority was being challenged. And for the first time in decades, the powerful Mafia boss found himself negotiating from a position of weakness. Investigators later discovered that the kidnappings were designed to force Profaci into financial concessions. The Gallo crew demanded that tribute payments to the boss be reduced and that profits from family operations be distributed more fairly among soldiers and captains. In essence, they were demanding a restructuring of the family itself. For a traditional Sicilian Mafia boss like Profaci, the demand was an insult. But the kidnappings had created a dangerous situation. Several powerful captains were being held hostage. If they were killed, the consequences could spiral beyond Profaci's control and threaten the stability of the entire New York Mafia structure. So negotiations began. According to multiple documented accounts, Profaci agreed to pay a large ransom to secure the release of the hostages. The Gallos appear to have succeeded in forcing the boss into compromise. The captives were eventually released. For a brief moment, it seemed the crisis had passed, but the peace was fragile, because Joe Profaci had no intention of honoring the agreement. Within weeks of the hostages being freed, the boss quietly began organizing retaliation. The Mafia had rules, and one of the most sacred rules was loyalty to the boss. Joe Gallo had broken that rule in spectacular fashion, and Profaci believed the rebellion had to be crushed before it spread further inside the family. Investigators later discovered that Profaci began assembling loyal crews to hunt down the Gallo faction. Meetings were held quietly across Brooklyn and Long Island. Gunmen were assigned targets. Allies were recruited among captains who remained loyal to the old boss. The conflict was no longer a negotiation. It was now a war. The first violence erupted quickly. Drive-by shootings became common in neighborhoods where the rival factions operated. Safe houses were attacked. Members of both crews began traveling with armed escorts, aware that assassination attempts could come at any moment. Restaurants that once hosted quiet mob meetings became battlegrounds. Brooklyn, which had long been one of the Mafia's most stable territories, suddenly found itself in the middle of an internal blood feud. According to law enforcement reports from the time, the streets around Carroll Gardens and Red Hook became especially volatile. Gunmen waited outside social clubs and apartment buildings, watching for rival crew members to appear, and the violence escalated rapidly. Several members of the Gallo faction were ambushed in separate shootings throughout 1961. Some survived, others did not, but the Gallos refused to back down. Joe Gallo, in particular, seemed almost energized by the chaos. According to multiple accounts from associates, he viewed the conflict not merely as survival, but as a revolution against the old Mafia hierarchy. He believed that if Profaci could be weakened or removed, the entire power structure of the family could be reshaped. But there was one major problem. The Commission was watching. The Leadership Council of the American Mafia had little tolerance for internal wars that attracted police attention. A prolonged conflict inside one family threatened the stability of the entire national organization. And the Profaci War was quickly becoming exactly that. Investigators later discovered that senior Mafia figures from other families began pressuring both sides to reach a settlement. But by that point, the violence had taken on a life of its own. Gunmen from the Gallo faction began targeting Profaci loyalists directly. Bomb threats were reported at businesses connected to the boss, and at least one assassination attempt came dangerously close to succeeding. One night in 1961, gunmen opened fire on a vehicle believed to be carrying one of Profaci's top captains. Bullets tore through the car. The captain survived, but the message was unmistakable. The rebellion was no longer symbolic. It had become a full-scale internal war. And Joe Profaci, now in his 60s, was suddenly facing the most dangerous challenge of his entire criminal career. According to multiple documented accounts, the aging boss grew increasingly paranoid during this period. He traveled with armed bodyguards, changed meeting locations frequently, and began limiting his public appearances. But the pressure inside the family continued to build. because the Gallos had done something unprecedented. They had shown that a mafia boss could be openly defied, and that idea alone was enough to threaten the foundation of the entire organization. But as the war dragged on through 1961 and into 1962, something unexpected began happening behind the scenes. Joe Profaci's health was deteriorating. Quietly, slowly. The powerful mafia boss who had ruled his family for over 30 years was becoming weaker with each passing month. And inside the organization, ambitious men were already beginning to consider the question no one dared say aloud. What would happen when Joe Profaci was finally gone? Because the war that had begun with kidnappings and gunfire was about to collide with something far more dangerous than rebellion. A power vacuum. A power vacuum. Inside the mafia, few situations were more dangerous. When a boss ruled with strength, the organization moved with predictable discipline. Orders flowed downward. Tribute flowed upward. Violence was controlled, calculated, and usually limited to external enemies. But when a boss weakened, something else emerged. Ambition. By late 1961, Joe Profaci's authority was no longer unquestioned. The rebellion led by Joe Gallo had already shattered the illusion of absolute control inside the family. Captains had chosen sides. Soldiers were carrying weapons not just against outside rivals, but against their own brothers. And at the center of the storm stood a man whose health was failing. According to multiple documented accounts, Profaci had been battling cancer. The illness was kept quiet within the organization. Publicly, the boss continued to maintain the image of stability. Meetings were held, orders were issued, tribute payments were still expected. But behind the scenes, investigators would later discover that the aging mafia leader was spending increasing amounts of time under medical care. And as his strength faded, the violence inside the family only intensified. The Gallo faction continued its campaign against the boss's loyalists. Shootings erupted across Brooklyn. Social clubs were raided by gunmen looking for rival crew members. Safe houses became necessary for high-ranking figures who feared retaliation. The war had dragged on longer than anyone expected, and it was attracting attention. Law enforcement agencies had begun closely monitoring the situation. Internal mafia conflicts created opportunities for surveillance, informants, and arrests. Federal investigators understood that organized crime thrived on secrecy, and a violent internal feud was the exact opposite of secrecy. According to police records from the time, detectives began mapping the conflict carefully. They identified the two factions. On one side stood the loyalists of Joe Profaci, many of them older captains who had built their careers under the traditional mafia hierarchy. On the other side were the rebels, the Gallos, young, aggressive, and increasingly bold in their attacks. But while the war continued on the streets, a second struggle was unfolding quietly behind closed doors. Because if Joe Profaci died, someone would need to replace him. And several powerful figures were already positioning themselves for that moment. One of those men was Joseph Magliocco, Profaci's longtime underboss. Magliocco had remained loyal throughout the rebellion. Even after being kidnapped during the early stages of the conflict, he had returned to the boss's side once negotiations secured his release. Within the structure of the mafia, the underboss was the logical successor, and many believed Magliocco would take control if Profaci's illness became fatal. But the situation inside the family was far more complicated. The rebellion had created deep fractures. Even if Magliocco became boss, the Gallo faction would remain a powerful and hostile force within the organization, which meant the war might not end with Profaci's death. It might only grow worse. And then, in June of 1962, the inevitable happened. Joseph Profaci died at the age of 64. His death was not violent. There were no gunshots, no dramatic assassination, no cinematic final confrontation. The powerful mafia boss who had ruled for 3 decades died quietly from cancer in a hospital. But the truth was far darker than the quiet hospital room suggested. Because Profaci's death did not end the conflict he had created, it intensified it. Joseph Magliocco officially became the new boss of the family. But the organization he inherited was already deeply unstable. The rebellion led by Joe Gallo had not been crushed, and many younger members of the family saw the leadership transition as an opportunity for even greater change. Magliocco attempted to restore order. He opened negotiations with the Gallo faction. Temporary ceasefires were discussed. Attempts were made to reunify the fractured organization. But the trust that once held the family together was gone. The war had left scars, and Joe Gallo had not forgotten the assassination attempt carried out against his crew during Profaci's final years. According to multiple documented accounts, the violence continued even after the leadership change. Shootings still occurred, retaliation still followed, and inside the Mafia Commission, patience was beginning to run thin. Because the instability inside the former Profaci family was now threatening the balance of power among New York's 5 families. The commission had one priority above all others: control. And if that control could not be restored internally, the leadership of the family itself might have to change again. What happened next would become one of the most dramatic betrayals in Mafia history. Because Joseph Magliocco, the man who had inherited Profaci's throne, soon made a decision that stunned the underworld. He attempted to assassinate 2 members of the Mafia Commission. The targets were Tommy Lucchese and Carlo Gambino, 2 of the most powerful bosses in America. Investigators later discovered that Magliocco had secretly ordered the hits in an attempt to eliminate rivals and expand his influence within the commission. But the plan failed. The man assigned to carry out the murders, Joseph Colombo, did something unexpected. He reported the assassination plot directly to the commission. According to multiple historical accounts, Colombo understood that carrying out the murders would plunge the entire Mafia structure into chaos. Instead, he exposed Magliocco's plan. The consequences were immediate. The commission summoned Magliocco to answer for the conspiracy. In Mafia politics, plotting the assassination of fellow bosses was one of the most serious violations imaginable. Magliocco was stripped of power, forced into retirement, and the leadership of the family passed to the very man who had revealed the plot, Joseph Colombo. The Profaci crime family was soon renamed. It became the Colombo crime family, the name it still carries today. But the transformation of the organization did not erase its violent history, because the rebellion that Joe Gallo had started years earlier would continue to haunt the family long after Profaci's quiet death. The streets of Brooklyn would see more shootings, more betrayals, more internal wars, and decades later, investigators and historians would look back at the moment when Joe Gallo challenged the aging Mafia boss and realized something important. The rebellion against Joe Profaci had changed the rules. It showed that a Mafia boss could be defied. It showed that power inside the organization was not permanent. And perhaps most importantly, it proved that sometimes the most dangerous battles in organized crime were not fought against rival families, but against the men sitting at the same table.